That was the moment Renee made her decision. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just looked at the phone in her hand. The screen still lit up from his call, and something inside her went very, very quiet. People always imagine that life-changing decisions happen in dramatic moments, that you feel thunder in your chest, or the room spins, or tears pour down your face. But when it actually happens, when the thing you've been trying not to see finally becomes impossible to look away from, it's quieter than that. It's just a door closing softly behind you. This is the story of how Renee got to that hospital room, and what happened after she walked out of it. Renee Calloway grew up in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of house where the walls were thin and everybody knew everybody else's business. Her mother, Patricia, worked the early shift at a grocery store and came home smelling like bleach and cardboard. Her father, Darnell, worked construction when work was available and drank on the weekends when it wasn't. They weren't cruel people, they were just tired. And in that tiredness, Renee learned very early to be small, to be useful, to not take up too much space. She was the kind of kid who did her homework at the kitchen table while her parents argued in the next room, who learned to read her mother's face in the morning to know what kind of day it was going to be. She got good grades. She stayed out of trouble. She told herself that if she could just hold on, just be patient enough, life would eventually open up into something wider. When she was 22, she met Derek at a friend's birthday party. He was 30, already had his own apartment, drove a clean car, said please and thank you. After a childhood of watching her father disappear on weekends, Derek's steadiness felt like safety. She mistook stillness for peace. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday night in his apartment, a ring from a jewelry store she'd never heard of, and she said yes before he even finished the sentence. Her mother cried. Her friends told her she was lucky. She believed them. The first year of marriage was fine. The apartment they shared in Cincinnati was small but bright. Derek worked in logistics management, made decent money, and Renee had just started a job as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized insurance company. She liked the work. She was good at organizing things, at making systems run smoothly, at being the person people came to when they needed something done. But Derek didn't like her working late. He didn't like when she had drinks with coworkers after a long week. He didn't say these things as demands. Not at first. He said them as concerns. I just worry about you driving home at night. I just think those people at your office aren't the right crowd. I just feel like we never have time for each other. Renee, who had spent her whole life learning to shrink herself to fit the shape of other people's needs, began to make herself smaller again. She stopped going out after work. She started coming home earlier. She told herself this was what marriage looked like. Compromise, consideration, putting someone else first. By their 3rd year, she had left the insurance job. Derek had been offered a transfer to Memphis, and the timing lined up with an argument they'd had about Renee spending too many evenings on a work project. She quit. She told herself it was a mutual decision. Memphis was lonelier than she expected. She didn't know anyone. Derek was at the office by 7:30 and often didn't come home until 8 or 9. Renee filled the hours with grocery runs, meal prep, keeping the apartment spotless. Derek noticed when things weren't done. He did not often notice when they were. She started applying to jobs again 6 months after the move. Mid-level administrative roles, nothing that would require late nights. Derek's response when she told him was measured and cold. He said he thought they'd agreed she would take some time. He said he'd been counting on having dinner ready when he got home. He said, and she remembered this exact phrasing because it lodged itself somewhere in her chest, I didn't think you were the type to be this restless. She pulled the applications. She told herself she'd try again later. Later became a word that carried a lot of weight in Renee's marriage. Later she would look for work. Later they would talk about having children, or not having them. Since Renee had been honest about her ambivalence, and Derek had been ambivalent too, or so she thought. Later they would take that trip to New Orleans she'd been wanting to do for years. Later things would ease up, calm down, get better. What she didn't see, or what she saw and refused to name, was that later never arrived. There was always a reason to wait. And while she was waiting, years were passing. She was 28 when she started noticing the headaches. Not the ordinary kind, not tension headaches from stress, but deep, nauseating pain that came on suddenly and left her lying in the dark with a cold cloth over her eyes. She mentioned it to Derek once. He told her she needed to drink more water. She was 29 when the headaches became frequent enough that she finally went to see a doctor on her own. The doctor ran some tests and referred her to a neurologist. The neurologist ordered an MRI, then another one, then a follow-up appointment where Renee sat alone in a beige office and was told that she had a condition requiring ongoing monitoring. Not life-threatening, the doctor said carefully, but serious. Something that required stress management, rest, and regular check-ins. She drove home and sat in the parking lot of a CVS for 45 minutes before she went inside. That night, she told Derek. She sat across from him at the dinner table after he'd finished eating, and she laid it out plainly. What the doctor had found, what it meant, what she might need going forward. He listened. He nodded. Then he asked if she'd remembered to call the landlord about the dripping faucet in the bathroom. She told herself he was processing. She told herself he showed care differently. She told herself a lot of things. The next 18 months were the hardest of her life. She managed her condition with medication and regular appointments, mostly alone. Derek came with her to exactly one follow-up visit, where he sat scrolling his phone in the waiting room. She stopped asking him to come after that. Meanwhile, something else was shifting. She didn't see it all at once. It came in small pieces, the way a picture develops slowly in a dark room. A number in his phone labeled only with initials. A weekend business trip that he'd mentioned twice but she couldn't find on the shared calendar they'd set up when they moved to Memphis. A woman named Cassandra who worked in his office and whom Renee had met once at a company event, who had laughed too loudly at everything Derek said. Renee was not the kind of woman who went looking for proof. She had been raised to not make accusations she couldn't back up, but she was also a woman who had spent years reading the temperature of a room before she walked into it, and she knew. She said nothing, she waited. She told herself she needed to be sure. She was 31 years old when she ended up in the hospital. It started as a particularly bad episode. Worse than the ones she'd learned to manage, worse than anything the medication had been controlling. She woke up at 3 a.m. unable to feel her left hand properly, a high-pitched ringing in her ears, the room tilting sideways. She managed to get her phone and call 911. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was sitting on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, very calmly and very methodically telling herself to breathe. The ER was fluorescent and loud, and she was alone. They admitted her for observation, moved her to a room, ran more tests. By mid-morning she was stable, the episode having passed without permanent damage. But the doctors wanted to keep her for 48 hours. She called Derek from the hospital room at 9:15 in the morning. He picked up on the third ring. She told him where she was. She told him what had happened. She told him the room number. There was a pause. Then Derek said he was in the middle of something at work. He said he'd try to come by that evening. He asked if she needed him to pick anything up. She said no. She said she'd be okay. At 3 p.m, her phone rang. It was Derek. She answered, expecting him to say he was on his way. Instead, he told her he wasn't going to make it that day. Something had come up, an evening meeting he couldn't miss. Then, in the same breath, almost without pausing, "By the way, did you call someone to come look at the dishwasher? It's been making that sound again, and I don't want to deal with it when you get home." Renee sat in the hospital bed for a long moment after the call ended. She had an IV in her left arm. She could hear the monitor next to her measuring her pulse in steady, indifferent beats. Through the window, she could see a piece of gray sky. She thought about Patricia, her mother, who had stayed in that thin-walled house in Columbus for 32 years and called it stability. She thought about all the times she had watched her mother make herself useful as a way of making herself necessary. She thought about herself at 22, standing in Derek's apartment saying yes before he finished asking. She thought about Cassandra. And she thought, if I leave this hospital and go home and fix the dishwasher, I will be doing it for the rest of my life, until I can't anymore. And there will be no one in the room with me when that happens either. She didn't cry. She didn't make a dramatic decision out loud. She just sat with that thought for a while and let it settle into something clear. She called her cousin, Beverly, who lived in Nashville. They hadn't talked in almost a year. Renee had let most of her friendships and family connections drift, the way you do when your world slowly narrows to fit around one person. Beverly picked up on the first ring and said, "Oh my God, Renee, I've been thinking about you," before Renee could even say hello. Renee told her what had happened. Not just the hospital, all of it. The isolation, the job she hadn't taken, the appointments Derek had missed, the initials in the phone, the way she had spent years making herself smaller and smaller and had finally run out of room. Beverly drove to Memphis the next day. She sat in the hospital room for 6 hours, and when the doctors discharged Renee, she didn't go back to the apartment on the same night. She went to a budget hotel 2 miles away, and Beverly stayed with her. The divorce took 8 months. Derek contested parts of it, contested them not out of any desire to reconcile, but out of the particular stubbornness of a man who doesn't like losing. He told mutual friends that Renee had been unstable. He told his family that she had checked out of the marriage emotionally. Cassandra, Renee later learned, had been seeing Derek for almost 2 years. They moved in together 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Renee did not have the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. She did not get to watch Derek face consequences in real time. She didn't say the thing she had always imagined saying, the perfect, devastating line that summed it all up. Real life doesn't work that way. What she got instead was quieter and, in the end, more lasting. She moved to Nashville. Beverly helped her find an apartment, a real one this time, with a window that looked out onto a small courtyard where someone had planted a container garden. She applied for administrative positions again. It took 3 months, but she found one at a university, a coordinator role in the student affairs office, full benefits, the kind of work environment where people asked how your weekend was and actually waited for the answer. She started seeing a therapist named Dr. Okafor. She went every 2 weeks for the first year, every month after that. It was Dr. Okafor who finally named something Renee had been carrying without a label, that she had learned very early to interpret self-erasure as love. That somewhere along the way she had come to believe that her worth was measured by how much she could accommodate, how little she could ask for, how quietly she could need things. Learning to unlearn that was not quick or clean. It happened in small, ordinary moments. Ordering something she actually wanted at a restaurant, instead of whatever was easiest, saying I need to think about it instead of agreeing immediately, telling Beverly when she was having a hard week instead of saying she was fine. Each one felt like a small act of rebellion. Eventually, they started feeling like just living. Her health stabilized. The neurologist in Nashville was thorough and communicative, and with the right medication, and a life that was no longer a constant low-grade emergency, her episodes became infrequent enough that she could go months without a bad one. She wasn't cured. Her condition was chronic, but it was manageable, and she was managing it, and those were different things now. 2 years after the divorce, she ran into someone from her Columbus days, a woman named Sandra who had been in her college orientation group and had never entirely left the back of Renee's mind. Sandra was in Nashville for a conference. They had coffee that turned into 3 hours and a walk along the river. Sandra was easy to be with in a way that Renee hadn't realized she'd been missing. Someone who was interested in her opinions, who laughed at things Renee said, who didn't seem to need her to be a particular way. They started talking regularly after that, then more than talking. Renee didn't call it anything for a long time, which was fine, because neither did Sandra. They just kept showing up for each other, consistently, without keeping score. That, Renee came to understand, was what she had always been trying to find. Not someone who didn't need her. She still liked being useful, still liked taking care of things. But someone who also asked, "How are you doing, actually?" Her mother called the month after Renee and Sandra started officially, whatever that word means when you're in your 30s. Patricia had heard from a cousin, who had heard from someone else, the way news travels in families. She called on a Saturday morning, and Renee sat on the floor of her Nashville apartment next to the window with the courtyard, watching someone water the container garden outside, while her mother talked. Patricia said she didn't understand. Then she said she was trying to. And when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, gone softer. She said, "I just want you to be happy. I always wanted that. I wasn't always sure how to show it. It wasn't everything. It wasn't an apology for all the ways that House in Columbus had taught Renee to disappear. But it was something, and Renee let it be something. She still thought about Derek sometimes, not with longing, with something more like curiosity, the way you might think about a house you used to live in that you don't particularly miss but can still picture clearly. She hoped, in an abstract way, that he had learned something. She didn't spend much time on it. What she spent her time on instead was smaller and more interesting. She signed up for a ceramics class on Thursday evenings. She called Beverly on Sundays. She got very particular about her coffee and started buying beans from a small roaster 3 blocks from her apartment. She let herself have preferences. She let herself take up space. 3 years after the hospital room, she sat in Dr. Okafor's office for what might have been one of the last regular appointments. She had been thinking about stepping back to as-needed visits, which felt like its own kind of Motelstone doctor. Okafor asked her how she knew she was ready, and Renee thought about it honestly before she answered. She said, "I think because I don't spend as much time bracing for things anymore. I used to always be waiting for the next bad thing, and I'm not doing that as much. I'm just here." Doc Okafor wrote something in her notepad and looked up. "That's it," she said. "That's actually it." Renee drove home with the windows down, even though it was a little cold. She had learned slowly and with considerable effort that the opposite of shrinking yourself is not becoming someone loud or demanding or difficult. It's quieter than that. It's just allowing yourself to exist fully, to want things, to need things, to say so when you need to. It was the same kind of quiet, she realized, as that hospital room. Only this time the quiet was hers.